Hello, welcome to On the Record. I'm Adam Jasser. When it comes to war in Ukraine, it seems we are back to square one. The ceasefire is a distant prospect, and Ukraine faces the fourth winter, struggling to repel relentless Russian attacks. At this precarious moment for Ukraine and Europe, I'm going on the record with Radosław Sikorski, Poland's foreign minister, to ask the basic question: is he afraid? Minister Sikorski, thank you very much for joining us.
Pleasure.
Minister, I want to ask you perhaps a silly question. What keeps you awake at night?
Well, we have a war at our borders, so obviously what happens, whether Ukraine manages to resist Russian aggression, is a key question for our country.
Can you explain that? What is at stake, really?
Well, Russia has established an expansionist neo-imperial state ideology with which it has brainwashed its soldiers, its children, its population. And in the beginning there is the word, and then the word becomes flesh, and it started invading its neighbors. First Georgia, now Ukraine. And of course, if Russia were to prevail in Ukraine, she would be tempted to use the territory, the industrial and human resources of that country to go further. And that's why it's important to keep Putin's army as far as possible away from our borders, which means helping Ukraine to defend itself.
Right, so, you know, you were in Afghanistan over 40 years ago, right? So you saw, you stared the Russian soldiers in the eye, right there.
And nobody gave the Afghan resistance any chance of success against the mighty Soviet Union. And yet the Soviet Union not only lost that war, but actually collapsed as a result. So do you believe this scenario is plausible in Ukraine? Because, you know, the world seems to be divided. Some people are saying there's no way Ukraine can win this war. The disparity of forces between Ukraine and Russia is, of course, much smaller than between the Soviet Union and Afghanistan. And our assistance to Ukraine is much bigger than our assistance to Afghanistan in the 1980s. Ukraine is planning to continue resisting for 3 years. Our job is to supply it with the resources to continue. And I think the process of the Russian economy suffering has started. And this war might end the way World War I ended. One side losing the means to carry on. So an implosion of Russia? Or Russian leadership's conclusion that it cannot be won and that therefore serious peace talks are necessary. Putin would have to admit to himself that he made a terrible blunder, criminal decision to invade, that it hasn't been 3 days, it's been over 3 years, and that perhaps 3 more years of this is beyond Russia's means. You have been saying this for a while now, that there will be a point when Putin realizes that he cannot win this war. Either Putin or his successor. Oh, all right. Well, we had Garry Kasparov here in the studio a week ago, and he said the reason why Putin rejected President Donald Trump's efforts twice already is because he cannot stop this war, because then he loses power. I think there is something to that. It's very difficult for a leader who started an aggressive, illegal war to admit the mistake, to change the decision, and to survive in power. So it is permissible to theorize that for the president of Russia, a bad war is preferable in terms of holding on to power than a bad peace. So is the peace process dead in the water? Trump's attempts to facilitate it, is it dead in the water, or is there still some chance for it? That's what the US said after the last round of conversations between Marco Rubio and Sergei Lavrov. Russia is still insisting on achieving maximalist demands that her successes in the field don't justify. Even if they conquer another town in Donbass, that's no reason for Ukraine to capitulate.
So you've been saying this a lot about America sooner or later realizing that Putin has no intention to give up. Do you think...
As Winston Churchill memorably said, the United States always does the right thing, having tried all the other options.
So this is your motto for today?
I hope the US will continue to supply Ukraine with intelligence data. Of course, Poland pays for the Starlink terminals. And the ammunition for US weapons to do with anti-aircraft and deep strikes capabilities are also important. Europe mostly pays for that, and that's why I think Europe should be more prominent in negotiating a future settlement.
But before the negotiations happen, there is a situation on the front line. The winter is coming. This is going to be the fourth winter for Ukraine. Do you believe, and this is what I was referring to when I asked if you were afraid or if you could sleep at night, will Ukraine survive this winter?
Well, both sides have a clear strategy. Russia has a strategy, which happens to be a war crime, of depriving the civilian population of the heating and electricity, particularly needed in wintertime. In other words, to cause so much hardship as to force Ukraine into capitulation. Ukraine, on the other hand, is hitting what are legitimate military targets, refineries that supply petrol for the Russian war machine, and also supply the Russian treasury with the means to continue the war. And of course, it's a race.
So another line from Kasparov that I wanted to bounce off you is that he said, one of the reasons why Putin is still playing a long game, that's why he's rejecting the Americans, even sympathetic American administration, that he believes the consensus in Europe can be broken sooner or later over Ukraine, given the popularity of some of the parties that are actually quite friendly towards him. And also because China is not really interested in finishing this war. And Kaja Kallas, the EU High Representative, said as much last week when she said, China told her directly that they don't want Putin to fall. So again, this looks terrible as a challenge for Europe.
We are not in the business of regime changing. We are in the business of restoring international law. Mm-hmm. So Russia can withdraw to the international border, and that would be the end of the war. And what happens in Russian politics is none of our business. But it's true that Russia couldn't continue the war without China's supply of dual-use stuff and trade. I agree with Garry Kasparov when he says that it would be good for Russia, for the myth of the empire to finally be buried, for Russia to lose that war so that a stake is put through Russian imperialism at last.
But that's wishful thinking, isn't it, given what's happening?
Well, Russia is the last European empire. I mean, all the others seemed eternal: Spanish, Portuguese, French, British, and Russia needs to go through its de-radicalization process.
But it happened in the early 90s when we thought Russia abandoned its imperial dream, and it seems it's alive and kicking.
Putin started as a modernizer, and I think then he was mired in corruption, but also he found that creating a modern kind of society was just too difficult. And so now he's in the groove of traditional Tsarist and Soviet propaganda and myths. And unfortunately, the people of Ukraine in particular, but also the people of Russia, are paying for his scheme to join the history books.
But Minister, again, we're focusing on Putin and Russia, but China is a major actor in all of this. And you used to be in the European Parliament responsible for EU-Chinese relations. How do you see this? How do you see China playing, a game where it's actually positioning itself in a win-win situation? Because the war is bad for Putin, but it's also bad for Europe.
My friend and mentor Zbigniew Brzezinski once said that the choice strategically for Russia is to be either an ally of the West, but that requires respecting some rules, or a vassal of China. And Putin has chosen what is not in the interest of Russia, but is in his own personal interest, namely staying in power. And you're right, China is getting a vassal not just on the cheap, actually while making money. But it also means that Europe sees this, and there are other things that are happening in the relationship between Europe and China, and it's why we are rearming, and it's why we are creating shorter supply chains to make ourselves less dependent on trade with China.
But you know how long everything takes in Europe, and you know this whole mechanism of making decisions, we see how cumbersome it is. So China has leverage now, and Europe is hoping to have leverage in maybe 5 or 6 years' time.
True.
So how do you bridge this gap?
That is constitutional. We are a confederation where ultimate sovereignty is with the member states. All our big power centers have unity of command, whether the United States or Russia or China, which puts us at a disadvantage. It's true, but it also means that rule of law is more secure here.
Explain that, because it's not entirely clear to me.
Because there's no centralized power in Europe. Therefore, the rules that we've made are more solid, are more difficult to change.
But we live in a time when hard power counts. And we see even the United States occasionally ignoring international rules. And Europe was this place which played by the rules and hoped to export them to the entire world. Now the entire world says, well, you know, actually hard power is better. Excuse me, thank you. So is Europe adapting to this new environment fast enough?
Good question. I don't know what the answer will be, but you know, we've just had an election in Holland where centrists have won. Populists are not winning everywhere, and we have to do the right thing. Poland has become a wealthy country thanks to the rules-based European and international order, and we should continue to support it because it's been good for us.
But even in Poland you have huge divisions, right? And if you look at opinion polls, you see actually there is a majority of eurosceptic parties.
80% of Polish people are still satisfied with
Poland do you explain this
being
discrepancy?
in the EU, and of course everybody knows that the British now regret having left. But you're right, there are populist parties, there is Konfederacja, but also the main opposition party, which used to be eurosceptic, is now europhobic. And I'm concerned at the amount of fake news or outright lies about the European Union, and we should counter them, because I saw, as did you, the intellectual roots of Brexit, and it's when the establishment fears countering false narratives that they become the received truth, and they lead to political choices, anti-European political choices, which would be a tragedy. Poland has hugely benefited, both economically and in terms of protecting its independence by being a member of the EU.
But at the same time, we see these parties that are eurosceptic calling, because the opposition in Poland and some of these other parties, they're very clear with their messaging. They're saying too much Europe, too much Brussels, we want more sovereignty.
Yeah, but they also lie. You know, they don't tell you that if you leave the European Union, there would be a barrier to doing business. Like Britain has increased the amount of bureaucracy in international trade. They don't tell you that it would mean the abolition of the free movement of capital and of people across Europe. It would, people take the good things for granted.
Right. Okay, but at least it's a vision. But it seems sometimes that, particularly in Poland, the government doesn't have a clear vision of what it wants Europe to become. There is this whole debate about what next for Europe, how to make it more agile. What would be your...
We need to complete the single market, for example, in capital markets and services. We also need a defense Europe, and we're doing it. 150 billion euros, that's real money for defense industries, of which Poland will get a third. We are still spending the the money allocated for dealing with the consequences of pandemic, digitalization, upgrading health services, and green technologies. I mean, look at how modern Poland has become, and how much better our infrastructure is, and how much cleaner everything has become.
Maybe I'll give you an example I was more thinking of, which is enlargement, accepting new members from the East. Yesterday there was a report by the Commission, their progress card, scorecard, if you will, and the commissioner responsible for accepting and negotiating with the new members, she said, we don't want to let more Trojan horses in. We need to have safeguards in place. We need to have a probation period. This is a language that shows that many in the European Union, many in the western part of the European Union, are concerned with the EU governance in terms of making decisions or not being blocked by a single country such as Hungary. What is Poland's view on how this can be resolved, this tension between staying as a union and at the same time this pressure for more individualistic decision-making, let's say?
So first of all, the bigger any organization is, the harder it is to run it by consensus, by unanimity. But unanimity is not the only form of democracy. Secondly, what you've just said is exactly the legacy of populist rule for 8 years in this country and still in Hungary. Poland, under our populist government, proved that that having fulfilled the criteria of rule of law, as a member, you can backtrack. You can start destroying the independence of your judiciary. So yes, for future members, the criteria of membership will be even higher.
So are you saying that this is Hungary's and Poland's fault?
I'm saying it is the fault of our current opposition. When they were in government, they scared the rest of Europe with members that are capable of backtracking. Yes, they have made the accession of Moldova, Ukraine harder, which is not a good thing.
So what comes next? How to resolve this? What are the, in your mind, what do you think would be a compromise here? How to structure the future EU decision-making models?
The accession negotiations are a very difficult process. It took us 7 years. Ukraine is doing it while fighting a war, and you have to fulfill very exacting criteria. In that sense, there is a probationary period already. For example, you need to coordinate your foreign policy with that of the EU. And as you know, some of the current members are not in line with current EU policy. So it's absolutely legitimate.
So is this going to be written into their accession treaties, some of this stuff? Do you expect the language of the accession treaties to be much more precise and harder on these new members?
With every passing decade, the amount of common EU law is bigger. And therefore, it is harder to accept it in your own internal.
But this is what President Nawrocki in Poland and the opposition leader Jarosław Kaczyński exactly hold against the EU, that there's too much EU rules and regulations.
The EU is run by the Treaty of Lisbon. The Treaty of Lisbon was negotiated by Jarosław Kaczyński as Prime Minister and ratified by President Lech Kaczyński. If Kaczyński now believes that he negotiated badly, he should admit to it and apologize. And he should not be scaring people about a hypothetical future treaty because nobody has an even draft of a text. And a hypothetical future treaty would have to be agreed by the European Council, agreed by the European Parliament, agreed in the parliaments of all the member states, including Poland, and would have to be ratified by the current eurosceptic Polish president. So instead of lying to Polish people about how the EU works, we should be having our own ideas how to improve it. Because, of course, it's not an ideal. Like any human institution, it has flaws. I, for example, think that the pace of decarbonization was set too ambitiously. And we are correcting it literally today.
So you welcome today's announcement?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do.
Why is it so important to Poland?
It's important because we want to take care of our planet, but we have to do it at a pace at which the people can accept it and with the minimum cost to the economy.
Is there a trade-off between defense and spending more on defense and responding to the Russian threat and climate?
There is always a trade-off between guns and butter. This is what the Russian Federation has imposed on us.
So guns should take precedence over
Well, unfortunately, here in Poland, in this city, there was a Russian governor for 100 years. We don't want that ever to happen again, and we will pay whatever it takes.
Last question, Mr., because we're running out of time. This was already almost 15 years ago that you made a speech in Berlin in which you said, I quote, I paraphrase, you fear German inaction more than I fear German power. And now Germany announced it is going to have a strongest army in Europe of 500,000 people. For your and my generation, this is still a somewhat scary prospect. Any second thoughts on that?
Well, if you listen to my last expose, my speech to the Polish parliament, I doubled down what I said 15 years ago. I said that as long as Germany is democratic, as long as it is in the EU and NATO, I fear German pacifism more than German armaments.
And you stick to this view?
Yeah, I do.
Minister, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for watching. This was On the Record. See you next week.